Hello, and thank you for joining us for Votebeat's first virtual event, Checking Citizenship, a conversation with two Secretaries of State. At Votebeat, our reporters have been covering efforts to require citizenship proof from voters at the state and national levels, reporting on the SAVE Act pending in Congress, the president's executive order on elections in March, and state legislation in, for example, Texas and Wisconsin. To keep up with our reporting, please follow Votebeat on social media and subscribe to our newsletters at votebeat.org/newsletters. Also, we're a nonprofit newsroom and our journalism relies on support from our readers. Please support our work and events like this one as you're able by giving any amount at votebeat.org/donate. You can also find these links by clicking on the resources tab in Zoom. Only 2 states have experience administering and enforcing such a proof of citizenship requirement. Our Votebeat Arizona reporter, Jen Fifield, tonight will moderate a conversation with Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes and New Hampshire Secretary of State David Scanlan about the practical realities of requiring documented proof of citizenship from voters. Arizona has had a documented proof of citizenship requirement to vote in state and local elections in place since 2004. In New Hampshire, a requirement for citizenship proof from anyone registering to vote in any election went into force before local elections this year. Secretary Fontes was elected to be Arizona's Secretary of State in 2022. He was previously the Maricopa County Recorder and is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. Secretary Scanlan has been Secretary of State since 2022. He was previously a Deputy Secretary of State and is a former member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives, who served as Majority Leader in his final term. He is also a licensed forester. Thank you both very much for being here with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and I'm going to turn this over to Jen and to our guests.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. I am so glad to have our two secretaries here, and there is a to get into, so we're going to start here. I'm not sure if you heard me for that, so I'm going to repeat it. Hi, everyone. It's good to see everyone here today. I'm so excited for our conversation, and we have so much to get to, so let's jump in. First, a question for both of you. Secretary Fontes, if you want to start, since your state passed the proof of citizenship requirement so long ago, I wondered if you could give us background on where that came from. Like, was there evidence of non-citizen voting? Was it a general election integrity effort?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and thanks for keeping us public servants accountable, Jen. You've been covering elections here in Arizona with various outlets for a while, and so we appreciate your work, even when it's a little uncomfortable for those of us in elected office sometimes. Arizona, in 1996, began verifying legal residence in Arizona through the Motor Vehicle Division as a means of attaining state benefits. In 1996, it wasn't until 2004 that the documented proof of citizenship requirement pertained specifically to registering to vote. And so because there was a great database, or I should say a lot of data, I won't say a great database because it's anything but there was a lot of information that we already had at the state level pertaining to the notion that folks were legal residents in Arizona. The voter registration system was adjusted to try to capture some of what was there in the motor vehicle division. Unfortunately, that wasn't done properly, and it wasn't done perfectly. And so in rarefied circumstances, individuals who may have been indicated to be legal residents were sometimes considered to be citizens. And although most, if not all of those cases did not result, in fact, very, very few of them ever resulted in a non-citizen voting, we remained moving through and bringing more and more and more folks into the system through the regular voter registration processes where they would bring in their documentation either to the MVD when they were registering to vote or to the various registrars of voters, which in Arizona, each of our 15 counties elects a county recorder. This person also serves as the registrar of voters. And the transmission of those documents was pretty much any way folks needed to get it done, really depending on the elected official administering this portion of what was happening. So, for example, when I was the county recorder, we were accepting text message photographs of passports. We were accepting just about any way that folks could show us in a document, this is how it works. That wasn't the way it was in prior administrations. And this is another way that elections do matter. In fact, when I became the county recorder in Maricopa County, I found tens of thousands of voter registration forms that had been rejected for a lack of documented proof of citizenship. And there was an absolute inconsistency as to whether or not those folks had ever been sent a letter or had ever been followed up with to determine whether or not the registrar was following up to say, hey, we still need this document to get you voting. And as a matter of fact, there were several cases where many eligible citizens were denied the right to vote for 17 different election cycles that they may have been eligible for. And this practice went back years and years and years. And so the impetus for all of this was the same impetus that we've seen for a lot of the various bits of legislation in Arizona as against certain populations. It is the willingness of some folks to try to bend a political narrative that is not based in fact in order to attain or retain political power. And we do not have, nor have we ever had, any significant cases of non-citizens who actually cast ballots. I think the systems that we have had in place have worked very well to ferret out or to ferret in the appropriate folks who fall under the appropriate status. It is the state of the law in Arizona, and what we do know since then is that we had misidentified, frankly, going back to this database thing, we had misidentified a whole bunch of folks. I think something around 218,000 of these folks who had registered prior to 1996 that did not have these documents on record at the Motor Vehicle Division. And I'll sort of Reader's Digest this. You might get into this more later. We're in the process of going back and redoing a lot of this contact with these voters out there in all of the states. Although I will say, as of the date of this event, Maricopa County, the largest county that has 2/3 of Arizona's voters almost in it, has not sent out any notifications to any of their voters. And so it's a bumpy road when you get into depending on data systems that were not designed to handle this type of data and the variety of data that is required to fulfill the needs of these regulations. And if you don't have the full package, it's a very, very rough road. And it frankly, I'll just say this at the top, and you'll hear me say it over and over again. This notion of documented proof of citizenship is really a solution looking desperately for a problem.
Thank you so much. We will get into a lot of that later. And I think Secretary Scanlan, you probably have a different perspective on where this came from in your state, where the new law originated.
Well, first, thank you, Jen. It's great to be here with you and Secretary Fontes. And you're absolutely right. Each state in the country has its own set of election-related laws and requirements. And New Hampshire's landscape in that regard is very, very different from Arizona, in that we are one of just a handful of states that has been exempt from the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 because at the time we had election day registration. And as a result of that, our voter registration process has gone down a different path than most of the other states in the country. We don't link up with our Division of Motor Vehicles to have voters apply for voter registration when they're getting a driver's license. We are beginning to compare data on a fairly regular basis, but we don't have non-election official sponsored voter registration drives in New Hampshire. You can't send a mail-in voter registration application. The voter registration process is intimate and it is direct between the voter and their local election official, who in many cases they already know. New Hampshire is a small state. We have 309 polling places, and there are very few communities that I would call transient, where people are really moving in and out rapidly, so that you're less likely to know an election official in those towns. But this discussion is of a national nature right now, and there are different reasons for it. And a lot of it is just, political rhetoric. A lot of it is perception about the need to tighten up voter qualification issues. I would agree with Secretary Fontes that there's only a handful of instances in New Hampshire where we've actually prosecuted individuals for inappropriate voting. It does happen in every election, but it is not organized. It is not on a large scale, and yet, in many cases, we're reacting to perceptions that are out there about, who is trying to vote that shouldn't be, and things like that. We do know that there are individuals who have gotten on the voter rolls with green cards because the official that were registering that individual just didn't understand what that card means. It means that that individual is not a United States citizen, but they are legally in this country, and they can get a driver's license and a real ID and things like that. So anyway, based on that national rhetoric and the fact that the Republicans are in control of the legislature, and I'm a Republican myself as Secretary of State, they passed a law to tighten up the documentation that is required in New Hampshire to be able to register to vote. There had been a period of years, probably a dozen years or so ago, when voter registration requirements were very, very lax, to the point that the definition of domicile residence was ambiguous. And based on that definition, you could be a person moving through New Hampshire on election day, and you could be eligible to register to vote. So the legislature started by tightening that requirement up. The Supreme Court in New Hampshire issued an opinion that said that based on the new law, you did in fact have to be a domiciled resident of New Hampshire to be able to vote here. And move fast forward, the legislature has tightened it up even more now to require that when a voter registers to vote, they have to document their identity, their age, their domicile, and their citizenship. In most cases, we're finding we've had one election now with that law in effect, and they were local elections. So we did not have the surge of turnout that we expect we'll get in a state election with federal offices on the ballot. I expect that with that, there are going to be more voters that don't have their documentation, and we're going to have to prepare for that. And we're going to have to prepare by educating as best we can the population of individuals that need to be registered, that they now have to bring these documents with them to be able to do that. There were some voters that showed up at the polls in the local round of municipal elections this past spring that did not have the appropriate documentation with them, and they were told that they had to go home and retrieve it and bring it back. In most cases, the voters did that, but there were some that did not return to the polling place. We also know that there is no single federal database that contains citizenship information, and as other states, get on the bandwagon and pursue a strict requirement of citizenship documentation, that we are going to need resources to be able to help voters make that qualification. And I think that the states that are going in this direction are going to have to be prepared to be a resource for voters to help them obtain that documentation if they don't have it.
That's a really good point, and I do look forward to talking and learning a bit more about how your first elections went with your new law. You guys have both talked about already how state law sets how and when voter registration happens, and it happens different everywhere. You talked about, for example, the registration deadline. You can register day of in New Hampshire. Wouldn't that be great in Arizona? Or would it? Because does that complicate the process of checking documents and make sure that you can verify eligibility for voters? So if you could talk a little bit about how your specific state laws on voter registration have impacted you as you tried to implement the law, how it's affected voters, and also just kind of what you wish state lawmakers would have thought about it when implementing this, because you had the state laws that you did. Secretary Scanlan, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. New Hampshire has kept its election process fairly simple, and that is a good thing because voters know what to expect when they go to the polling place. And um, a lot of our traditions, our election traditions, are rooted in our colonial history and have remained unchanged for a couple hundred years. And we are looking, I mean, we're implementing technology. We're using electronic ballot counting machines. We're starting to use e-poll books in polling places. We have accessible voting equipment. But in doing that, we try and keep the actual processes the same so that the voter may be dealing with a new format, but they understand the process that they're going through. Um, we have resisted attempts to go to no excuse absentee voting or all vote by mail, drop boxes, voting centers, and things like that. And that's not to say that those things are bad. They're certainly innovative, but the fewer moving parts from our perspective and does two things. It reduces the mistakes or errors that can take place during the election process, but it's not confusing to the voters when they try and engage in this process. The other the other thing is political. We have two political parties right now that are polarized, and New Hampshire is, I wouldn't necessarily call it a swing state at this point, but it is certainly purple. And we have sometimes some dramatic swings in which parties in power of the legislature, and they want to put their stamp on the election process, um, usually using the muscle of the party that is in power. And I look at that process a little bit differently. And when I testify before the legislature, I start off by saying that there are two sides. There are two important uh, areas with elections that need to be addressed. First is uh, everybody that is qualified to vote should be able to exercise that right without a lot of difficulty. At the same time, I like to explain that the people that participate in that process, the voters, also have a right to know who else is participating in that election and that those individuals are qualified. But those two areas have a tension with each other. You make it easier to vote. You have to back off on the requirements a little bit. The more you require qualification, documentation, the harder it might be to exercise that right. If in the extremes, if you make it too hard to register to vote, you're creating a situation where voter suppression can exist. And the other side of that is if you make it too easy to vote so that anybody can walk in and you're lax on requiring the qualifications, you create an opportunity that fraud can exist. So it should be the responsibility of the legislature to try and find that sweet spot in the middle somewhere where it is easy enough to vote, but people are satisfied that the people that are participating are qualified. And um, I think it would be great if there was a requirement um, I'm way too optimistic, I'm sure, but that that legislation related to elections should have some degree of bipartisan support. And, I don't know if there's a special rule that can be passed to allow that to happen, but, everybody needs to agree on what the game rules of the game are going to be, as opposed to just trying to force, a certain perspective, a certain law down everybody's throat, and people have to live with that. So that's a struggle, and hopefully we'll get there at some point. But uh, that's my perspective.
That's really interesting. Just come live in a swing state, and then everything has to be a compromise, right? Yeah, Secretary Fontes, anything about our law in specific, or what you wish lawmakers would have thought about when implementing this law in our state?
Yeah, I wish the lawmakers would actually pay attention to the folks running the elections before they start passing all of these laws. And I'll go back to a point that, again, I said I would repeat several times. This idea of documented proof of citizenship is a problem, is a solution looking for a problem. This is not a problem in the United States of America. There are onesie twosies instances where folks do make attempts. We've had a couple documented here in Arizona. One of them was literally, the guy said he was doing it as a joke. He paid the consequences. The other one was a guy who was saying he was just testing the system. He paid the consequences. And we've heard one of our colleagues from Georgia on a national program say they caught 1,600 people trying to register to vote. And the retort is, yeah, they tried, but they did not succeed. So the checks and balances in the systems that we already employ across the United States of America are very good. And I think when we talk about sort of these systems and sort of the requirements that Secretary Scanlan spoke to, I think those interests that he mentioned that the voter has, that the voter is able to do what they need to do, and that the voter is aware of sort of who else is doing this, that makes a lot of sense. The idea of transparency and availability of public information is important. But I would make another distinction, and that is the question of ease of voting. And I would split up the notion of ease of qualifying to vote versus the ease of casting a ballot as a qualified voter. These are two very different functions within the election administration systems. Whether you make it onto the voter rolls is one thing, and how you get your ballot and cast your ballot is an entirely different story. So, for example, in Arizona, we don't like to keep things simple. We like to give our voters a ton of different choices. We were the first state to have online voter registration, which eliminated in a lot of ways one of the issues that Secretary Scanlan brought up, and that is the human error that comes in, whether or not you've got great training or people aren't paying attention. You'd never get a green card holder in Arizona who would end up registering to vote if they went to a registrar or if they went through one of these other systems, because we're much more familiar with green cards in Arizona than many of the other states are, being a border state. So, I think there's a geographic, there's a volume of participant issue here, and there's some stark differences, I think, in the manner with which this happens. So as to the ease of registering to vote, there's a bunch of recommendations I could come up with there. But as far as the ease of actually casting a ballot once you make it onto the voter rolls, Arizona makes it about as easy as anybody else does, if not easier. We have 27 days of early voting. We have no excuse absentee voting, which was initiated in this state by a Republican legislature, brought on by a Republican governor, and promoted by the Republicans for decades. Literally, it's been active in Arizona and continuously growing over the decades since the early 90s. And so we're up to, I think, well over 85% of our voters who choose to get their ballot by mail. It's a convenience that very few, if any, voters go away from once they're there. It works very, very well. And we've got some great security measures that go along through that. We can get to those details there. But there are some other things I think that are important differences between our two states. For example, we have a bifurcated ballot. And what that means is that for several years, in fact, I think since 2013, Arizona has fed only ballots. These are ballots for folks who have qualified under the federal rules, which means you sign off an affidavit like everybody else in the country does. You say you're a citizen and you get to vote in federal elections. But We also have a state ballot for those folks who haven't fully provided their or who have fully provided their documented proof of citizenship. This will have state and federal ballots. That's the full ballot. So you've got your federal ballot, if there's no documented proof of citizenship, and your full ballot. And that makes things a lot more difficult for election administrators, particularly in some of our larger counties. For example, Maricopa County, in my tenure, we built that voter roll up to 2.5 million voters. That's where technology comes in. You cannot administer an election like that without those sorts of systems that take away the notion of human error in a lot of those spaces. So, we're coming at this from not only different parts of the country, but I think from very different spaces as well. And one of the things I think that's really critical as you approach the notion here is this: regardless of what the rules say, are the folks who are administering these elections, the folks who are actually doing the day in and day out work, the data entry, the voter contact, the follow-up, all of these sorts of things, are they willing to go that extra step to make sure that the voters get what they need, and that is their fundamental rights preserved? Do they get that American dream fulfilled insofar as we get to elect who our political powerful people are versus having somebody else choose? And this is, I think, fundamental to what it is that we're talking about here. In my view, the notion of all of the sudden, and I think David alluded to this, all of the sudden we need to worry about ineligible voters voting en masse, and we've got to make massive changes that could very well alienate a lot of voters who have been voting for a long, long time. It seems a little tail wagging the dog, and I don't know that there's any proof out there that would support this. There's no data out there that would support this kind of a move, particularly when it's balanced against the possible risks that so many of our voters might be facing if they're not able to find documents. I mean, it's really that simple question.
Definitely. And I have a quick follow-up question on online voter registration. How crucial do you think that is in implementing something like this? And also, we use our driver's license to prove citizenship. If you didn't have those two things, which many states don't, how much more difficult would this be?
Well, we were using our driver's license to prove residence, not necessarily citizenship. And there was a distinction there that some folks, for whatever reason, chose to ignore a while back. And they're like, all right, let's just, knock our socks off and get all these people doing what they need to do. It is important. And I think particularly where it comes to online voter registration, the availability there is really important. And you have to work with the Motor Vehicle Division, because they are really the repository of so much of the data that we draw into the voter registration system. And so they've got to be doing their job just right. But here's the hook. And even for the last 20 years, you've got a Motor Vehicle Division that's like, we're not in the business of voter registration. We might click a button and ask folks, if you want to, what party do you want to be a part of? But that's their entire role in their minds. And generally speaking, that's, when you don't have appropriate training, when you don't have the appropriate appreciation of what it means to be the difference between a legal permanent resident, to be holding a residential visa of some sort, or to be a naturalized citizen versus a natural born citizen. These are important distinctions. These folks really hadn't been administering an entire agency with that in mind. And then you have another added circumstance here where we've sublet a lot of these activities to private vendors. There are plenty of providers, third-party providers out there of Motor Vehicle Division activities. You can register your car, get a driver's license, get your all kinds of things done with the state through third-party vendors in Arizona. And we saw in a 2023 audit of some of these that there were some very serious concerns that were put forward to the executive from the Auditor General in this regard. So there's a whole bunch of factors that are involved here that I think folks need to be very, very cognizant of. And so back to that one question, I think that David ended on, what would I do to change in the law? I would have any piece of legislation that was going to impact elections administration writ large, get a sufficiently covering statement from the Elections Officials Association in the state to say, here's what this law will do in implementations, here's how much we think it will cost, and have that impact statement come forward at the committee level prior to moving forward in the political process. That will really cause a legislature to think carefully, and it'll get the professionals involved early in the process. You can let the politicians change the law as they will. They get elected to represent the people. It's not for us to tell them what to do. But if they do it willy-nilly, the way they have done for many, many years, without any of this expertise underlying their determinations and their decision-making, we could get a mess on our hands. And I'm afraid that's what's going to be happening state by state now that we suddenly have this fever based in no evidence whatsoever.
Speaking of the federal push, we have the SAVE Act and Trump's executive order. So, Secretary Scanlan, can you talk about how those laws would differ from what you have in your state as far as what documents are required, anything like that?
I'm just trying to think of the provisions in the SAVE Act that, that are different from our state law. Our state law is requiring the citizenship information, which is certainly a component of the SAVE Act. What I hope that if the SAVE Act is going to pass, that that they do is make the federal information related to citizenship available for the states to use as a resource to help those voters that are going to struggle finding the documentation that they need. From the state perspective, I think we're the only state in the country that has vital records as one of the divisions of my office. So we have access to a lot of birth and death information that we're able to utilize directly in helping people that were born or died in New Hampshire, to get that information. And we're looking to expand that. There may be some national databases that we can use for birth, and that helps prove citizenship. So we are in the mode right now of just trying to find what resources are out there that will be available to help those individuals that we know are going to have difficulty proving that they're qualified, even though they are. And that's going to be the big hole in this whole process, is finding those individuals that can fall through the cracks.
And I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about that during your first election, what you learned about who was not able to prove citizenship when they tried to register to vote. What surprised you about your first election? What you would have done differently?
I was not surprised by any of the voting activity on the day of the election with that law. There again, these are local elections in New Hampshire. They're usually low turnout affairs. The people that are voting are generally not registering on the day of the election. They've been voting for some time, but of the voters that did show up to register, there was a small percentage that did not have the documentation that they needed. They were sent home to go retrieve it and bring it back. Most of those individuals did do that, but there were some that just left and they never came back. And we weren't keeping track. We weren't doing inventories or polls of those individuals. It's just all anecdotal information. But what that tells me is that we know that there's a population out there that are going to need some help. And that help has to come in two ways. Number one is we have to go way above and beyond in the education process, the voter education process, so that they understand the requirements of the new law. We know from past experience with things like voter identification to get a ballot and things like that, that there is still going to be a population that is not going to get the word, that that they won't be exposed to the education efforts, and we're going to have to be prepared for that. And New Hampshire is facing a couple of lawsuits that have been filed over the new law that passed, and we will see where that goes. We haven't gotten very far into it yet, but part of that discussion is going to be individuals that are qualified to vote that just simply don't have the documentation. And if they can prove that it is very hard for them to get it, we'll have to see where those lawsuits go.
Oh, that's really interesting. Can you talk about, did you do education statewide? That was a question from one of our guests here that came in before the election. And do you plan to do more?
Yes. And so when I became up in Secretary of State in New Hampshire now, 3 years, but I've been Bill Gardner's deputy for 20 years. Bill Gardner was, I think, the second longest serving Secretary of State in the country. He retired after 46 years. But in the time that I was deputy and becoming Secretary of State, I was seeing a general decline in voter confidence, which coincides with the partisan tension that we see now in the area of elections. I mean, it used to be elections were the sleepy thing that were administered by the state, and the people go vote, the results would be announced. It was no big deal. You might have a few recounts, but that has changed a lot. And so knowing that there's a decline in voter confidence before the SAVE Act and the law that passed in New Hampshire and the issue of citizenship generally, I saw a need for voter education just to kind of control the decline in the confidence that we're seeing nationally, but also starting to show up in New Hampshire. So I've taken steps like hiring a communications director, which we never had before. I have a person that was hired specifically now for voter education and civics outreach. And we've been doing a lot more with schools and populations of senior citizens, individuals with disabilities, minority groups in New Hampshire, veterans. And we're really reaching out, trying to engage them and get them involved in the process, not only encouraging them to vote, but serve as poll workers, understand the process so that you can talk to people about it yourself. And we are doing a lot more now with traditional media, but more importantly, social media, which is where a lot of the younger voters get their news and their information. And it is really important to have a presence on those platforms to help get the word out.
Great. Secretary Fontes, if we could switch to you, I know that there's a little bit of camera difficulty going on, so hopefully we'll keep you here. Obviously you talked a little bit about the problem that nearly a year ago your office announced that the state had not been properly collecting proof of citizenship for decades now for nearly or more than 200,000 longtime citizens or longtime residents of our state. So can you talk just a little bit about that and what you've learned specifically from the difficulty of creating a system to track voter citizenship? You mentioned the communication between the MVD, but what about like the costs involved, the systems involved, that kind of thing, and any advice you would give to states on it?
Yeah, first, don't do it. It's a bad idea. It doesn't need to be done. It's wholly and completely unnecessary. We already have plenty of systems and checks and balances. Number one. Number two, the reason why you shouldn't do it is because we've seen folks without a full set of support try to administer these things unsuccessfully. My predecessor already told that story. Other sorts of individuals who are trying to, meet these guidelines without the appropriate kinds of training, and moreover, without the appropriate kinds of support. Implementing new regulations like this takes a lot of time and energy. It takes a lot of planning, and many folks are just thinking, well, the data's out there somewhere. Well, it's not, and it's very difficult to find. And I don't know that any of the folks who are sponsors of the SAVE Act or are looking in a variety of different states like this have any idea what this looks like in volume. Arizona is a very transitory state. People come and go out of this state all the time. Imagine if you had been a victim of Hurricane Katrina and your local parish courthouse basement had been flooded where all of those records were kept, and they all got pulled out with the mud. Where's your birth certificate? Where are those records going to be found? And so we've got all of these scenarios that we can imagine where eligible citizens, actual US citizens, might not be able to vote. Moreover, you got to think about, other folks who don't fall into the quote unquote norm. We've got 22 tribes, 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona. The SAVE Act does not recognize tribal ID. We do as the state. So, like, did someone just forget that the first Americans are actually citizens too? So you've got the funding issue, you've got the database issue, you've got sort of all of these other sorts of voters out there issues. So my advice to other states is don't do this because it's not that big of a deal. You've got many other problems where your time and energy could be better spent. That having been said, we're in a political space where the idea of election administration and this sort of new fashionable space that a lot of people want to pretend like they're experts in is seen as a political sport. David talked a minute ago about how this was just kind of a sleepy area where folks just did the job. Well, we just did the job and we continued to improve and improve and improve bits and pieces, fits and starts, including a little technology, but we did it. And now Dave's been doing this for 1 or 2 years more than I have. I'm being kind, Dave. And there were changes and there were updates and there were innovations, but they were thoughtful and they were careful and they were tested. And in places like Arizona, particularly out in the Mountain West, where we have ballot by mail, we didn't just pop this thing into existence out of nowhere. We worked on it very carefully and we expanded these things and we had lawmakers who were thoughtful and careful. We're not seeing any of these foundational ideas of appropriate and proper governance behind this new idea of we need documented proof of citizenship. And the negative impact on actual eligible US citizens is what I worry about. And that's what I'm very, very passionate about. If you are a natural born citizen, if you've been voting for decades and for some reason the state of Arizona didn't have that documented proof of citizenship, we should bear the burden. We should be the ones at the government to figure out how to ameliorate this, how to fix this. Adding more and more burdens onto voters, at the end of the day, that's voter suppression. And if we were going to have sort of the end all do all, it would take a hell of an investment at the federal and state levels. And I would argue that it would be in the tens of billions of dollars to make sure that we are covering every eligible citizen, because at the end of the day, that's what we have a responsibility towards. And so, I get that people are really interested in this stuff, and I fully understand that some people may have very pure motives. I'm not really questioning the motives of everyone interested in this. Some people's motives I will question. I'll take a little bit of liberty there. But, if we really want to do this the right way, we must be thoughtful, we must be willing to do the work, and we must be willing to spend the money. And none of that is really happening right now. And so even in Arizona, where we've had the experiences that we've had, where we've exposed the notion of insufficient programming in our databases and running with, 2x4s and duct tape through these sorts of electronic systems, it just doesn't work. And it doesn't work the way it ought to. It doesn't work the way our voters deserve, regardless of their political party. Because at the end of the day, in my view, these sorts of requirements are not going to have as bad of an impact on my political lean as they would on David's political lean and those populations. That's just kind of my guesstimation looking at the demographics and the way things work out. So I think this is a really important part of the conversation, and that is, how does this look like on the governance end? And are we actually being thoughtful and careful in the planning and execution towards this, in whether or not we think it's a good idea?
I understand where you're coming from, but I also know there's people that are very convinced that, and I'm sure you agree, only eligible voters can vote. And but some people believe that this is necessary to make sure that's not that that's happening. So
And you know, I can appreciate the concern. I think it is a concern because if I knew somebody was taking some of my power away, I would be upset too. Here's the difference. There's this one thing called belief, and then there's this other thing called facts. And I like to rely on data and facts. And I have yet to see any facts that would push me into the other column.
Secretary Scanlan, is there any way to do this? You've been tossing out a few ideas about, maybe if they can't prove it, we can find a way. Any ideas for how we could implement this in a better way?
Well, I think we're going to learn a lot over the next couple of elections, once these laws really kick into gear, and provided that, the court doesn't change course. But, we are looking at all kinds of things to help the voters, because that's the bottom line, is those individuals that are qualified, we want to see them exercise that right. And so we are accepting documentation that is, I mean, there are, forms of documentation that are just automatic: passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, depending on what the qualification is. How that information is delivered to us, we're looking at. If a college student is registering to vote in New Hampshire, and they live in another state, they're claiming Durham, New Hampshire as their new residence while they're going to the University of New Hampshire. If their mother can email them their birth certificate so that it's on their phone and they can present that to us, then we would accept that as proof of citizenship and potentially age, and other things. And we are looking at making sure that the polling places in New Hampshire have some type of access to our databases and whatever other databases may be necessary to help prove qualifications. Right now we still have polling places in New Hampshire that are in old meeting houses where there is no internet connection and things like that. A lot of them use schools, and of course schools are much better suited for that type of thing. So we're going to be just looking at all kinds of ways outside the box that will meet the requirements of the statute in terms of providing the documentation that's necessary. And the legislature passed the law. We're going to do our best to comply with it. And over time, hopefully, we can work through the bumps in the road. And I'm sure there's going to be a few.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. It sounds extremely difficult to do when you're doing same-day registration. So I'm sure you're setting a pathway for other states. And that actually brings me to my first audience question we got before the event, which is, have other states contacted Arizona or New Hampshire to ask about lessons learned or tips?
Well, I'll start. The short answer is no, not yet. I expect that we will get those questions, especially depending on what other legislatures do that are still in session. I know that Wyoming just passed a law that is pretty rigid. I know other states are talking about it. I know that when the Secretary of States get together at their biannual conventions, that there's discussions about these items, and we share information at those. And yeah, I expect that the questions will be coming.
I talk to my colleagues pretty frequently, and my colleagues from states all over this nation, both sides of the aisle, and they get the same feedback from me that you've received today. Don't do it if you can avoid it, and if you plan on doing it right, take your time and spend way more money than you absolutely think that you're going to have to spend, because it's going to be a rough ride, and give the voters the decent treatment and the respect that they deserve with a very robust voter education campaign if you're going to be doing this. This is a massive shift for the vast majority of voters in the country. And one of my other fears, if I hadn't brought it up yet, was and is the communication piece. I mean, we're tinkering around with a fundamental right here. And not only have I not seen any proposals to put any federal dollars or even many of these states that are thinking about this, state dollars behind these adjustments, we see even less motivation to actually reach out and educate those voters whose voting rights might suffer because of these changes. And I just think that that's unconscionable for a government to not only completely shift what makes longtime voters eligible to continue to vote, but then to not communicate with them in an effective way. That's rough to stomach, and I don't think it is the I don't think it's kind, and maybe that's not the word that the rough and tumble guy out here in the West would be talking about, but I don't think it's kind to approach this in the way that would jeopardize fundamental rights without really considering the perspective of the voters. First and foremost, it is their right to vote, not our role to administer, that ought to be prime in our minds as we do this. It is their natural born right, if they're a natural born citizen, that we are making harder and harder for them to exercise. And that's kind of rough. I mean, if you're a libertarian, you're not liking this too much. If you are a civil libertarian, if you believe that it is our role to administer these rights as easily and readily as possible with as few restrictions as possible, you should not be liking this at all. So, we can have differing viewpoints on a lot of things, but I think that we really need to consider the voters and put them in the prime spot of sort of our thoughtfulness as we proceed moving forward in other states. But we've been contacted by other states, and you can imagine what I tell them about it.
Thanks. We have a question from Caleb that I think was answered already, which is the additional level of resources needed. Secretary Fontes, you spoke a little bit about that. I don't know if either one of you wants to add anything, though.
I will just add the idea that you're going to have to process a whole new set of paperwork, and you're going to have to train folks to process that whole new set of paperwork and reprogram your computer systems to be able to accept that new column of data, that new set of data. What is it going to look like? How are you going to categorize it? I mean, there's an enormous amount of backroom technical work that has to go into these sorts of things before you even get to reaching out to voters. And there's a lot of costs that can be involved in those sorts of things, depending on where you're holding that data. And that's just the technical side.
Secretary Scanlan, you have anything on that you've learned in the last year?
Well, I agree with that. It's going to require resources. It's going to require outreach. And the bottom line is the voters have to be aware that these are the new requirements and help them be prepared for it. And that will require financial resources and a lot of additional help.
We have another question from Quinn Raymond about what percentage of your state's registered voters have not provided proof of citizenship. I think this will be very different for both of the states that we're talking to. Secretary Fontes, do you know the answer on the top of your head there?
It's a chunk less than 10%. I think it's far less than 10%. In fact, I think it's less than 5%. It's a really small number. But we've got a variety of different ways that we go through and follow through and chase down the information and stuff. And I can tell you it's just that follow through alone is pretty expensive when you're administering to, millions and millions of voters. So it's a pretty small number.
Yeah, in New Hampshire, I don't have enough election related information to really gauge that. The best gauge that I have is 12 years ago, we passed a voter ID law in the state, and there was a concern that there was going to be 10 or 11% of the population that would not have an acceptable form of ID under that law. It turned out to be just a fraction of 1%. And so, I think that this will be similar, although I think it's probably easier to get an acceptable ID than it would be to find a lost citizenship document. So I would expect the number would be small, but maybe not as small as the experience we had uh, with voter ID.
If I could add one little piece to this, there are very few, if any, states that I'm aware of where an individual can get a free copy of their birth certificate or a free passport. That just doesn't exist. And so that added financial cost onto the voter that has never existed in most of the country is something I think that folks really need to take into consideration as they're working through this, because we know that, while it's not, for some people, it's de minimis, for some folks it might be relatively difficult.
All right, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have some just on the type of documents that you accept in your state, which is going to be different probably in every state that does this, but a few questions before the event were, are you actually validating the birth certificates? Are you just accepting them as is? And why aren't we using social security numbers? So if you want to jump on any of those questions, go for it.
Well,
Because
yeah, I mean, if the Vital Records Department is issuing these certificates and folks are giving us these documents, it is incumbent on the individuals to truthfully provide, to provide truthful documents. And we know that there is fraud out there. We know that that exists. No, we're not going to call the Vital Records Department over in New Hampshire if we've got, someone from out there who moves to Arizona. If they present it to us, we're going to accept it. If they present a passport, we're going to accept it, which is another one of the issues I think that's critically important here, right? Like, how does this actually change things? If somebody says I'm a U.S. citizen and they swear under penalty of perjury with with that possible, implication of criminal act as to the false swearing, or on the other hand, they provide us with a false document, we're not equipped to go check and verify every single one of these. So really kind of like, does it actually help? Right. And that practical foundation of that question is just so mind-bogglingly simple that it takes us to the end of this thing to get there. And I'm just like, yeah, what if they give us a fake birth certificate? We're not going to check. We can't. It would be impossible for us to do so. And so if the folks who really want this to happen want to create a federal database and they want to go through the exercise of validating hundreds of millions of people who are already registered to vote as citizens, or all 330 plus whatever million people that are here, like, knock your socks off. But you're going to have to get past the fiscal hawks, because that's going to be absolutely prohibitive to have that verified documentary proof, because it's not verified. We take what they give us.
And the standard in New Hampshire is it more likely than not, 50% plus a feather. If somebody shows us a birth certificate or a passport and we have no other information to say that, this isn't real, then we're going to accept that at face value. And as I mentioned earlier, if a college student has a photo of their birth certificate on their cell phone to show the documentation, we will accept that, short of any information that we might have to the contrary.
Let me just add in, we do reach out to Immigration and Naturalization Services for those naturalized citizens. And there's a variety of different other checks and balances. But if somebody comes with what appears to be a valid passport, what appears to be a valid birth certificate, whether it's from Arizona or another state, we're not going to chase that down. That just ain't going to happen. We don't have the capacity for that.
Definitely, that would take a lot. Well, thank you both so much. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the great questions today. If you didn't get your question answered, you can email us, community@votebeat.org. We'll try to help. Please continue to follow our coverage on the topic at votebeat.org. And thank you so much to our two secretaries. This was really great and informative today. As Carrie mentioned, we're a nonprofit that relies on the generosity of readers. So thanks everyone for donating to support the event. If you learned something new, you want to continue to support us, go to votebeat.org/donate. And thank you so much again to our panelists and for everyone for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Good to be with you, Dave.